Most people hear Soviet education and immediately picture rigid propaganda, state-controlled classrooms, and students reciting approved answers on command. But here's what nobody talks about. The USSR produced a disproportionate concentration of world-class mathematicians, scientists, chess grandmasters, and thinkers. That wasn't luck. It wasn't natural talent. It was a system. And that system is still the most effective blueprint for building serious intelligence that exists. Here's the full playbook. Here's the thing about the Soviet education system that most people completely miss. It wasn't about producing obedient students. It wasn't about memorizing state-approved facts and reciting them on command. It was about building minds that actually worked. And the first thing that system demanded, before anything else, was something almost nobody today is willing to do. Go back to the beginning, not skim the beginning, not glance at the basics and convince yourself you've got it covered. Actually go back, find every gap in your understanding, and fill it completely before moving forward. The philosophy was straightforward and ruthless. A skyscraper built on weak ground isn't impressive. It's dangerous. And most people today are building skyscrapers on weak ground every single day. They rush to the advanced material because the advanced material feels smart. It sounds impressive. You can drop it into conversations and watch people nod. But the moment someone asks a foundational question, the whole thing starts to shake. Because you never actually built the base. The Soviets went the other direction entirely. Before a student touched calculus, their arithmetic had to be flawless. Before they wrote essays, grammar was drilled until it was unconscious. Not comfortable. Unconscious. The kind of deep where you don't think about it anymore because it's just part of how you operate. And connected to this was something even more powerful. Soviet intellectuals had a deep suspicion of second-hand knowledge. They read Marx, not summaries of Marx. They read Tolstoy, not the abridged version. They read Einstein's original papers, not the textbook distillation someone else produced decades later. Because here's what summaries actually are. They're someone else's interpretation. The original source, you form your own understanding. You catch things the summarizer missed. You see the argument the way it was actually constructed, not the way it was later simplified. And in any room, any conversation, any debate, the person who read the actual source will always have an edge over the person who read about it. Always. So here's the modern translation, and it's not complicated. Think about the last subject you kind of understand. Not fully, not deeply. Just enough to get by. That's the one. Go back to page 1. Read the source, not the summary. Fill the gaps you've been quietly ignoring. Because the fundamentals aren't the boring part of becoming intelligent. They're the only part that actually makes everything else possible. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because most people assume the Soviets were grinding alone in silence. Heads down, grinding through textbooks by sheer willpower. That's not what happened. The method they actually used was something far more effective, and modern neuroscience has spent decades catching up to what they already knew. Soviet students studied in groups, but not the way most people study in groups today, where half the room is copying and the other half is pretending to understand. These groups had a specific purpose. You were there to teach each other, because teaching something is the most powerful way to learn it. The moment you try to explain a concept out loud to another person, the gaps in your understanding become impossible to hide. The hesitation, the fumbling, well, it's kind of like, those aren't embarrassing moments. Those are the exact moments that show you precisely what you don't actually know yet. But here's the Soviet twist that made it something more than just a study technique. The study was collaborative. The ambition was quietly competitive. Everyone in that room was trying to understand it better than everyone else in the room. The group was the whetstone. You were the blade. And outside of those study sessions, the learning never stopped. The Soviets had a concept called samoobrazovание, self-education. And it wasn't a hobby. It was treated as a lifelong duty. Waiting in a bread line, you had a book. Commuting on the metro, you were reading. Not articles, not headlines. History, science, philosophy, literature. The kind of reading that actually builds something inside your mind over time. Think about what that compounds into. 1 hour of serious reading every day is over 300 hours of deep learning every year. Over a decade. That's an almost insurmountable lead over everyone who spent those same hours on things that evaporated the moment they looked away. And then there's memorization, which modern culture has almost completely abandoned in favor of just knowing where to find things. The Soviets would have found that thinking somewhere between baffling and contemptible, because information stored in a database cannot make connections while you sleep. Your brain works with that constantly, unconsciously, making connections you never consciously initiated. They didn't study harder. They studied in a way that made every hour count twice. Here's what actually separated Soviet thinkers from everyone else in the room. It wasn't just what they knew, it was how their minds were built to operate under pressure. Because knowing things and being able to think clearly when someone pushes back on those things are two completely different skills. And the Soviets trained the second one deliberately. Start with the Olympiad mindset. From a young age, Soviet students competed in academic Olympiads: mathematics, physics, chemistry, linguistics. And the problems they were given weren't just difficult. They were specifically designed to be unsolvable by memorization alone. You couldn't brute force your way through them. You had to actually think. Sitting with a problem for hours without a solution wasn't a sign that something was wrong. It was the entire point. That struggle, that discomfort of not immediately knowing the answer, was where intelligence was actually being built, not in the moment of solving it, in the hours of wrestling with it before. Most people today Google something the second it gets uncomfortable. What the Soviets trained an entire generation to sit in that discomfort and push through it. That's not a small difference. That's a completely different relationship with hard thinking. Then there's dialectical thinking, which is probably the most underrated intellectual weapon on this entire list. Before entering any debate or serious discussion, a well-trained Soviet thinker would do something most people never do. They would construct the strongest possible argument against their own position, not a weak version of the counter-argument, the best version, the one that actually hurts. And then they would resolve the tension between the two into something deeper and more defensible than where they started. This is why they were so formidable in intellectual settings. By the time anyone challenged them, they had already fought themselves. Their weak arguments had already been defeated internally. What remained was a position hardened by pressure testing from the inside. Compare that to how most people hold opinion. They form a view, they get attached to it, and the moment someone pushes back even slightly, the whole thing either collapses or turns into defensiveness. The dialectical thinker doesn't get defensive, they get sharper, because their position was built to survive pressure, not avoid it. And underneath all of this was one cultural habit that tied it together: the separation of self from idea. When a Soviet intellectual culture at its best treated ego attachment to your own thinking as an obstacle, not a virtue. You held your ideas seriously enough to develop them rigorously, and lightly enough to abandon them the moment the evidence said you should. That's not natural, but it's trainable, and it's the difference between someone who sounds smart and someone who actually is. And here's where everything compounds into something most people never see coming. Because the first three principles are about what you learn and how you learn it. This one is about time, and time is the variable that changes everything. The Soviets dominated world chess for decades. Botvinnik, Tal, Spassky, Karpov, Kasparov. Name after name after name at the top of the game for generations. And chess wasn't treated as a hobby or a leisure activity. It was practically a national curriculum, because chess trains something that transfers into every area of life. Long-term planning, pattern recognition, calculating consequences multiple steps ahead before making a single move, staying composed when the pressure is highest, and learning ruthlessly from every loss instead of rationalizing it away. Most people react. Chess players anticipate. And that habit, the habit of asking what happens next, and then what happens after that, before committing to anything, is one of the most quietly powerful thinking skills a person can build. Yeah, but the chess wasn't even the deepest part of the long game. The deeper part was this. Being a narrow specialist in Soviet intellectual culture wasn't admired. It was considered almost embarrassing. The ideal was the comprehensively developed person, someone who could speak with genuine authority across history, science, literature, mathematics, and philosophy. Not surface-level familiarity, actual depth across multiple domains. And this wasn't just cultural preference. It was a cognitive strategy. Because the greatest breakthroughs in history have almost always come from someone taking the logic of one field and applying it to the problems of another. Shannon used Boolean algebra to invent information theory. Darwin used economics to understand biology. The cross-disciplinary thinker sees connections the specialist is completely blind to. Every new domain you build genuine knowledge in is another lens you can point at every problem you encounter. Then there's the social environment, which matters more than most people want to admit. In educated Soviet circles, intelligence and depth of thinking were the primary sources of social status. Not wealth, not appearance. How clearly you thought and how much you genuinely knew. That created a reinforcement loop that kept raising the bar for everyone inside it. Surround yourself with people who are sharper than you. Let their standards become your standard. Because the ceiling of your intellectual growth is largely set by the average of the people you measure yourself against. Foundational knowledge, built slowly and seriously, compounds over decades in a way that no shortcut can replicate. Modern culture sells 30-day transformations. The Soviet system was built on the understanding that real intellectual power takes years to develop, and that this is not the obstacle. That is the advantage. The Soviet Union is gone. The system it built for turning ordinary people into extraordinary thinkers, that's still here, and it still works. Fundamentals before flash. Teach to learn. Read the source, not the summary. Pressure test your own ideas before anyone else gets the chance. Play the long game when everyone around you is chasing shortcuts. Intelligence isn't a gift. It isn't talent. It's a discipline, practiced daily without shortcuts over years. The room you want to be the smartest person in? Start building the person who belongs there, right now. The first step is subscribing to my channel. See you in the next one.